Yes, it is time to continue to discuss my pure hatred for the Dark Ages. Yes, absolutely. Now, so far on this channel, I've been posting videos that go over all the problems that deal with the Dark Ages and its existence. And by that I mean its non-existence. The Dark Ages is not a real thing that happened. The fact that the Dark Ages is in our chronology in any capacity is a testament to the stupidity and the gullibility of humankind. That is literally what it is. And if you think people aren't exploiting this, think again, right? But that's another topic. We won't go schizo yet. All right, so what I want to do is I want to keep going and showing more scientific proof that the Dark Ages never existed. Now, one of the things that we have covered in this show series, whatever the hell it is so far, is we started looking at stratigraphy. Now, stratigraphy is extremely important in disproving the Dark Ages. Why? Why does that matter? Okay, so the first thing is that stratigraphy is used by the mainstream to often, if not really all the time, really show datings for their particular pet theory, right? Or whatever mainstream story needs to be supported, the stratigraphy is there to generally support their story. And if it's not there to support their story, like it's not there at all with respect to the Dark Ages, then the mainstream will then twist, they'll twist the science, or in a lot of cases, especially when it comes to the Dark Age situation, they will just ignore the stratigraphy, right? The stratigraphy is 100% against the Dark Ages. Now, stratigraphy is a fascinating science in and of itself, right? And there's a lot we can learn from stratigraphy. And one of the things that we can learn from stratigraphy is what does not happen in history. What did not exist? What did not transpire? And that is exactly what the stratigraphy shows us with respect to the Dark Ages. And that is nothing happened. There's no reason to scientifically believe in this concept. And this is important. This word scientifically, that's not scientifical. Scientifically, it is important to pay attention to science. Yeah, and that's a true statement. I don't think that should be argued. I do believe that we should pay attention to real, honest science, right? Now, the real, honest science that deals with stratigraphy has been showing archaeologists that this whole concept of about 1,000 years that have been added to our timeline is not there. There's nothing there. There is no reason to believe that this happened. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue to embrace science, and the science very clearly shows us that the Dark Ages don't exist. If you believe the Dark Ages still exist, after looking over the scientific evidence, you are a religious zealot, and religious zealotry shall not be tolerated here. Right? Now a lot of people in the mainstream don't want to hear that, right? They think that they're on the right side of history, whatever term that is. They believe that they have it figured out, and they believe that the Dark Ages are there, and they completely ignore all the hard, factual science that proves that there's no such thing. Now, this puts people in a really bad position because they have to then admit that they're wrong. And admitting that you are wrong is very tough for a lot of people. Now, if you're one of those people who are happy to be wrong, then you are already ahead of like 99% of the planet. Good job. And hopefully that's why you're still here watching this garbage. Now, for those of you who are holding on to the Dark Ages and are still skeptical, skepticism is fantastic. But there has to be a point to where you look at the presented scientific evidence and start to analyze that, right? And we use our critical thinking skills, and we use common sense. And we also have to make sure that our ego is not getting in our way when we look at the evidence. Now, I'm going to show more evidence here in this show, more problems with the Dark Ages that show the ridiculousness of it, but that also scientifically prove that there's no reason to have that period of history injected into our timeline. Now, I get it. It's going to be hard to kick out 1,000 years, right? Because that is what not having the Dark Ages means. we're going to have to get rid of 1,000 years of AD chronology. Now that's a huge deal for anybody. I don't care who you are, right? Because in the Western world, at the very least, we run off of that chronology, right? We have a very nice set mainstream timeline, which you are not allowed to question in the mainstream. And then, there's just little details that apparently need to be worked out. But, the mainstream has it all figured out. But if the mainstream is wrong, which we are proving here on this show, and plenty of other people have proved wrong as well, you get rid of 1,000 years. So it's important to understand that I am not doing this lightly. The implications or the consequences of removing 1,000 years from our chronology, they're fairly devastating, not just because of your history class has to be rewritten, but because, there's a lot of people in power right now who have built their fortunes and their power structures off of a lot of the stuff that went on, or that is claimed to have gone on, in the Dark Age era. Now, if all of that stuff is fake and somebody has been benefiting from that, where does that leave them? And then where does that leave you as a person, right? I mean, it puts it on us, the common people, to then hold, the people in power accountable for the lies. And that's scary for a lot of people as well, I think. I think that might actually be more scary for the vast majority of people than just simply subtracting 1,000 years and moving on with life. It's easy to technically subtract 1,000 years and be like, all right, we messed up, 1,000 years gone, let's move on. But if there are power structures that have based themselves on lies and situations from the supposed Dark Ages, that means that you might actually... That means you as a human should be holding those people accountable. And it's tough because those people have a lot of power to make sure that you can't hold them accountable. And then all of that calls into question, your entire existence, actually. Wow, I mean, it's crazy. It goes on. It's pretty severe what we're claiming here. So we won't go into any more of that. We'll pull back. Let's just stick with going and getting rid of the Dark Ages, and then the implications for life in our future. I don't know. I don't know. That's a whole other problem, and we're not gonna talk about that. But isn't that interesting? That if you do get rid of the Dark Ages, suddenly it's kind of put upon you as a common person in the Western world to hold people that are in certain positions of power right now accountable for their actions. And that's not easy. And right now the population of the planet is fairly subdued. And I think a lot of people would run from this. And I think that's actually one of the main reasons why people do not want to look at the reality of losing 1,000 years in their history, because the implications are far reaching. It's not just removing 1,000 phantom years. It's also realizing that you and the life you live right now has been affected negatively by it. And yeah, okay. Now, all of that is fairly depressing, so let's get into the actual science of what we can do to get rid of the Dark Ages, and we will deal with the current society effects later. Now, at this point in this series, I have been focusing mainly on the Roman Mediterranean-ish kind of area. That deals with the Dark Ages and what they claim happens to Rome and all that stuff. But the Dark Ages affects more than just the Roman area, the Roman antiquity area. It also affects the rest of the planet. So I want to take us over to China really fast, and I want to show you guys some artifacts from China that once again are, sort of stumping the mainstream archaeologists. And of course, once a mainstream archaeologist is stumped, they just shut down and they don't say anything. They actually ignore this. But this is interesting. So let's set the stage here. Now let's have some fun. All right, so on your screen now is a screenshot of a horse statue that was found in China. All right, and this has been dated by mainstream. Now, if I show you this picture, and for those of you who are listening, if you can go check it out, just look at it really fast. But otherwise, it's basically a statue of a horse prancing. All right, it's a very, very unique position that the horse has. That's important. The pose that the horse has is important. So if you go and ask an archaeologist, hey, what dynasty is this horse from? I mean, what's going on here? What dynasty would have made a horse statue in this style? And the person may come back saying, well, I think that's the Han dynasty. And then if you go ask another person, they might say, well, I think that's the Tang dynasty, right? And you could do this and you would get both answers. Now, why do you get both answers? So here's the deal. The horse statue I have up on the screen right now is from the Tang dynasty. And this dates from between 800 and 900 AD-ish, which would be considered the early Middle Ages. Now, this archaeologist, mainstream archaeologist, would have no time telling you that this is the date of this particular horse statue. So we find ourselves with a problem right off the bat. The archaeologists and historians would not be able to properly date that particular statue. Now, it gets even weirder because the dates they give you are 700-ish years apart. Now, that's a problem, right? This is an issue that you can have a 700-ish, plus or minus, more plus, you can have a 700-ish year gap between what archaeologists would believe where this statue comes from. That's the first key point that I want to be taken away here. When we start to look at Dark Age artifacts, don't forget, the second you hear archaeologists start dating one artifact, you know, in the early 1st century AD and another one in like the 9th century AD, make sure you do not lose that amazing fact that these people are unable to give you one solid date for a particular style of statue. Not only that, but they give you a range of like 700 to 900 years for the statue. Now that is a problem. If you are studying history or archaeology, that is an issue. If you cannot date something, or if you date something wildly between like 700 years, you have a problem, all right? And you have to admit you have a problem. Now, admitting you have a problem is the first step to recovery. Now, please believe that mainstream history has a problem. Now, check this out. Here we find another horse statue in the exact identical position, carved in the exact identical style. Now, if we were to ask archaeologists again to date this particular horse, once again, they would give us that date range because it is impossible to date this statue to the exact dynasty because there are two dynasties that apparently in the mainstream carved the exact same identical horse, 700 years apart from one another. So just by looking at a picture, if they didn't know, if they didn't already know the actual statue and didn't already buy into whatever garbage, excuse they had come up with to date it that date, they wouldn't be able to tell you. It would be literally impossible. These statues and the statue style and the carving methods are identical. Now, the statue you see here is dated from 100 to 200 AD. That would be the Han Dynasty. If your skepticism started to tingle and you started to have questions, good. So let's look into that. Let's play devil's advocate before we go on. So one of the things you could say, and is said by the mainstream, is that you could say, hey, look, the Han Dynasty in 100, 200 AD, they created the style, they carved it. And then, the Tang Dynasty in the 800 to 900 AD era, they just copied it, right? They either copied it maliciously or they copied it out of respect. Either way, it was a copy. They used the same style and created what you see here. Now, that is a legitimate viewpoint, right? I mean, initially, when you look at it like that, you're like, yeah, okay. I mean, I could see that. Why not, right? I mean, it's the exact same excuse that archaeologists give when we're talking about, the Mediterranean era, whatever. Both are accurate, area and era, whatever. So when archaeologists, they go to look at the ruins in that area, what they did is they found the exact same problem, right? They know that the Dark Ages are for sure part of the chronology, right? So we have to date everything with the Dark Ages in mind. So when they go and they do that, what they start to find is that they find the exact same problem, right? They find early 1st century structures and artifacts match identical to 7th, 8th, and 9th century artifacts and structures down the line, right? And there's nothing in between, even from their perspective. right? So what they say is, they come across with the garbage. They start talking about, oh yeah, they were just, they were respecting their ancestors and they were using the style and they were reviving it and blah, blah, whatever the hell excuse they make. But they make the exact same excuse for the horses as well. Now that's all well and good, but why? Why do they have to make these excuses? Why can't you just get away with saying, yeah, I mean, they just copied or they just, revitalized it? The reason why that argument does not work, and it's one of the reasons why they have to have so much contrived garbage history thrown in there to make it work, is that these artifacts, these ones in China and then everywhere else, anything with the Dark Ages, it literally does not matter. All of these artifacts are not stratigraphically found superimposed upon one another, which is exactly what we would expect to find if the Dark Ages were real. Instead, what we find is that all of those buildings and those artifacts that belong to the second century AD, they are stratigraphically parallel with all of those artifacts and buildings in the 800, 900 AD era. This is a huge problem for archaeologists and historians. Because how are you dating something to 100 AD and then dating the exact same layer, the artifacts that are in the exact same layer, to 900 AD? What is the cognitive dissonance, the insanity, the hypocrisy is legendary in the mainstream mindset. The sheer amount of cope required to buy into the Dark Ages is ultimately basically not worth it. So there's no reason to do it. It's evidence like this that calls into questions even the most basic of Dark Ages claims. And this is everywhere. This stratigraphical evidence that mainstream has no problem using if it works for them. But the second it does not work for them, such as in this case, we don't talk about it. They immediately clam up and they're done. Like, there's no arguing with them. It's in the textbook already and we're right. I mean, that is literally their perspective on the whole thing. So when you're looking at artifacts and you see something dated with a 700 to 800 year time gap between two identical styled artifacts, that is your first clue that something is going on. And go look where these were found in the stratigraphy. Right, that can begin at least a piece of your journey. You don't have to believe me in any of this. Go and look at the science yourself. Right, they're finding these identical artifacts in the same stratigraphical layer. We can't argue with anything like that. Right, that's the evidence. So there's no reason to add 700 to 800 to 900 years to these discoveries. All right, now that's some China stuff. Let's go on to some more examples. Let's play some more picture games. On your screen now is a picture of a boat, right? Here you go. There's a picture of a boat. If I show you this picture of this boat, and for those of you listening, it's a single-mast square sail boat. If I show a historian or an archaeologist this particular picture of a boat, their answer is going to be dependent on what area of history they study. So if I go up to a Viking researcher and I say, hey dude, what is this? Like, hey, can you identify this boat for me? They're going to look at it and they're going to be like, yeah, it's a Viking square sailing boat. And they would go into it and they'd be like, yeah, that's it. That's the recreation, right? There it is. And they would be 100% correct. That is literally what is a Viking boat. I mean, there's no question about it. Viking boats looked like that. The problem we run into is that this particular boat that I am showing on the screen is not dated from the Viking era, right? We're not in the 900s AD. This boat is a recreation of a Roman era boat from 200 AD. If I show this picture of a boat to a Roman researcher, right, whose era is that area is that era, whatever. If I show that picture to them, they're gonna nod their head and be like, yeah, that's a Roman boat. So we have a problem, don't we? Right, it's the exact same problem that we ran into with the Chinese horses. We have one group of researchers telling us that this boat is from the 2nd century AD, or second, 3rd century AD. And then we have another group of researchers who are telling us that the picture of the boat is from the 10th century. What do we do with this? What are you supposed to do with this, right? And the worst part about the whole thing is, of course, both researchers are correct. Because look at this. Now on the screen, I am showing you what mainstream 100% agrees on is a Viking boat. It's the same damn boat. It is literally the same boat. How is it that we find ourselves in a position to where we are finding identical technologies and identical building structures 700 to 800 years apart from one another? It is almost like 700 to 800 years between these two boats never existed. And that is exactly what the evidence points to, right? You cannot use common sense and look at this and think that humans did nothing for 700 to 800 years. It's not going to happen. Why would the Vikings suddenly just be like, oh, you know what? We're just going to use the Roman boat technology just because. I mean, it worked for them, right? 900, 800 years ago. Now we'll use it. Why not? I mean, nobody's doing that. There is no one doing that. These boats existed in the exact same timeline, and they were used by people who lived concurrently. The Romans and the Vikings, they both used this boat. The funny part about this whole thing is that the way mainstream history looks at Vikings is that they didn't get the square sail until, like the 10th century and stuff. Like, they didn't have it until then. Right? Even though the square sail was apparently known in the 1st century and the 2nd century, they did not figure it out until the 9th century or the 10th century. And then not only did they finally figure that out, but they also decided to exactly copy boats that existed 800 years prior. It's ridiculous. They did no such thing. The people who used these boats in these pictures, they lived concurrently. And once again, that is exactly how we find the stratigraphy set up. There is not 700 to 800 years between these designs, but that is exactly what mainstream historians want you to believe. That for whatever magical reason, that once a boat design was made up in the year, 100 to 200 AD, miraculously it was then picked up again, the exact same design, 700, 800 years later. That is not happening. Our ancestors were not staring at the sun and drooling for 700 to 800 years. That was not going on. Even worse for mainstream historians is when you bring in the science, quote unquote, of dendrochronology. Now, if there's those of you out there who are trying to figure out a way around this, right? You got to figure out a way to explain why there's this 700-year gap. You might run to dendrochronology, right? The study of tree rings and wood and stuff. You might run over there and be like, well, this dendrochronologist says that it's like this and this, and they have the whole thing explained. It's like, look, the tree ring and the wood, it's, whatever. And you can find some of that, but that's all surface level. The very second you start to try to audit a dendrochronologist's outcome, their arguments generally and immediately fall flat. The reason why they'll always fail, actually, ultimately, the main reason why a dendrochronology position will always fail to be conclusively used as evidence to give a real date is because the science, it's not even science, the concept of dendrochronology sounds good on paper, but scientifically, it's trash. Scientifically, it is completely unreliable, right? So if you can give me dendrochronology, planks from the ship and wood, wood masts or whatever, and you can try to make a case, and that's fantastic, right? And you'll also try to throw in some sort of carbon dating garbage, another trash method of dating, but I'm going to do a show on getting rid of that crap. In fact, I'm doing that next week. I don't know. Anyway, but these dating methods are completely unreliable. It gets even worse because once you go and you start looking at multiple sources of dendrochronologists, which of course you should be doing, right? You should not just be looking at the people who agree with you. You should be looking for alternative explanations or other data from other quote unquote scientific sources. The second you go out of your comfort zone and go look at other dendrochronologists' outcomes, they don't match, right? And none of them match. They're all over the place. Some people's match, some people's don't. Some people's, maybe sort of match, but there's errors. None of them are conclusive. So we cannot use any of those dating methods to substantiate a claim that 700 years existed between these two ships. It's not possible. It's scientifically incorrect. So we discard those. Anyway, so those are the ships. One more example, and then I'm done blabbing. Now, this example is a good one, and I know I said two. It's kind of two. I know there's 4 things up here, but it's 2 sections. Anyway, so what we have here on the upper left-hand corner is a Roman Millefiori glass bowl created in the 1st century. All right. Now, for those of you listening, the bowl is basically, it's a bowl, and it's got a very specific pattern painted into the bowl. All right. Now, the second picture right next to that picture is another fragment of an Abbasid Millefiori glass bowl from the 8th and 9th century in the exact same style as the 1st, 2nd century bowl. Now, here's the interesting part. Both bowls are essentially identical. I mean, like literally identical. It gets even worse. Not only if you look at this picture, I mean, you can look at the picture and if I were to switch these pictures again and ask, the relative historian, depending on, what field they're in, if I were to show them this bowl, they would have to answer either the 1st century or the 8th, 9th century. Like, that's how identically close they are. To make matters even worse in the situation of the bowl is that they are chemically identical to one another. That is the killer. You can always try to make up the excuse like, oh yeah, the ancestors, that later on they were just trying to recreate what came before, right? You can make up that excuse, but what you cannot do is you cannot say that the people in the 8th and 9th century not only copied the pattern and the style, but they also went out of their way to ensure that the chemical fingerprint of the bowl was identical. That's not happening. When we see that kind of science, when we have a chemical fingerprint identical between 2 pieces that are oddly enough dated between, 800 years apart, we cannot say they were made, 800 years apart. It's not happening. That's not how chemistry works. That's not the point. You cannot do that. Nobody had the technology back then, or not even now probably, to sit there and chemically replicate what happened in the 1st century. It's not happening. What makes more sense? That the people in the 8th, 9th century chemically copied the bowl and the style? Or both the 8th and 9th century bowl and the 1st century bowl are literally from just the exact same time period and were made at the same time or around the same time. There's no reason to inject 700 years. We don't need to do it. All right. Now, the bottom example is the exact same problem, right? So we have on the bottom left-hand side, we have a jar, a Roman glass vase from Cologne. All right, now this is dated to the 1st century. And on the right, we have another fragment of an 8th to 9th century Abbasid glass plate in the exact same style as the 1st century vase. Like the style is identical. The artistic style is identical. If you were to put the vase and the plate together in a set, you would not guess that they were 900 or 800 years apart. You just wouldn't do that. It'd be ridiculous. You would say, no, it's the same set. And then your chemistry friend comes around and then he looks at the chemical fingerprint of the artifacts and he says, of course they're the same set. They are chemically identical. Why would you think they are from 2 different sets 800 years apart? And you both laugh and you both realize that they're the same set and life goes on happily because you're not injecting 800 years into your timeline for no reason, right? All right. You get my point? You see what I'm saying? These are just like a few examples. I could go on forever with these examples. But the point is that when you're studying, archaeology, history, whatever, when you start to find artifacts that look similar, from one date to a vastly different date, there's probably a good chance that there is no time gap between those 2 artifacts. Now, the Dark Ages is definitely one of the big offenders when it comes to this kind of thing, but we find this all throughout history. Now, I'm ragging on the Dark Ages right now because it just angers me to no end, but this problem plagues all of ancient history. It's all over the place, right? You know, between the duplicates, between the misdating of artifacts, between injecting phantom time or duplicate time, etc. That stuff is everywhere. So what I want you to take away from the Dark Ages situation is that just watch out for this crap, and then when you see it in other studies, don't be afraid to then challenge it, because there's probably a good chance that you are correct. Alright, and that's what we want. That gets us closer to truth. None of us are going to benefit from these lies, and there's certainly no reason to continue to propagate them. So just stop it. Alright, so hopefully I've shown enough evidence here to at least continue the case that the Dark Ages never happened. And we'll just keep going. I don't know, there's tons of other stuff to talk about. So we'll work towards the truth over the next, I don't know, 10 years or whenever this channel gets banned. I don't know, okay. Alright, I need to stop recording.